I was sharing in a devotion this morning that I never have experienced where stressing out or worrying about something has ever helped. Anybody ever experienced that, like stressing out? I was watching a show one time, and the guy was in big trouble, and his lawyer was saying, "Aren't you worried?" And he's like, "Would it help?" I just love that because, honestly, you know what? It doesn't help, does it? And, as Christians, we believe, and I think we have to believe, and in the midst of all that's crazy and all that's not going right in our life, we have to believe that all things work together for good to those who love God and those who are called according to His purpose. That He has everything under His control, and not only does He have everything under His control, but He actually loves us, right? He cares about us. He cares about what's going on in our life. He desires to see things work out just as we do. And though sometimes the path to that difficulty, the path to blessing, it leads through a dark thing, doesn't it? It leads to trials and tribulations and difficulties before the blessing comes. And that's the way it was for the children of Israel as they were in the land of Canaan, noticing that their food supply was running out, noticing that the crops were not growing that year, and so but they're thinking, well, probably next year, and next year wasn't panning out, and so they're getting to the end of their sustenance for life, and Jacob, he looks at his sons, and he's like, "Why do you guys just stand around looking at each other?" He just kind of pictured them sitting there like, I wonder what Reuben would taste like, or something like that. But here's this situation where they have to do something, and so he sends them to the land of Egypt because he hears that there's bread in Egypt. And of course, the reason that there was bread in Egypt was because of Joseph, who had been sent before. As they sold him off as a slave, by God, he was sent to save the world alive, and we've been talking about that. I don't think I have to rehash everything, but you remember that as his brothers went down, they encountered Joseph. They thought he was the man. They thought he was just this horrible government official who was just giving them a really hard time. But what he was doing was he was testing them to see if their hearts had changed. And sure enough, he finally got that confession from Judah. We're being judged by God, and this is all my fault. And so Joseph, of course, reveals himself to him, tells him, "Hey, I'm your brother Joseph," which I'm sure that they were freaked out. Here's this Egyptian official, and he's revealing himself as Joseph, and of course they're freaked out by it. And he basically says, "We're going to send you back down to get Dad." And of course Pharaoh sent him with carts and food and provision and everything. And so they went to Jacob and said, "Hey, your son Joseph is alive, and he's the ruler in Egypt, and we need to go back up there." And he didn't believe it until he saw all the equipment, all the carts and everything. And so they carried Joseph back up. Now, in this whole process, Joseph is preparing his brothers. And he says, "We'll get you in the land of Goshen. And that was the best of the whole land. It was the one place probably that still had green grass. Everything else was dead, and Goshen was the only place that you could, keep livestock. And so he says, "We're going to get you in the land of Goshen. Tell the Pharaoh that you're shepherds and that you want to be in the land of Goshen." And so he kind of prepares this whole thing. Because you can kind of guess, as you read through Joseph's comments to his brothers, that he's coaching them to say the right thing before Pharaoh so that Pharaoh will say, "Okay, yeah, it's great. You guys live over there." And the reason is because he knows that Pharaoh could just make any decision he wants to. And so he's just kind of preparing him for it. So it says in Genesis chapter 47, verse 1, "Then Joseph went and told Pharaoh and said, 'My father and my brothers, their flocks and their herds, and all that they possess have come from the land of Canaan, and indeed they are in the land of Goshen.'" And so he didn't just tell them, "Hey, we're going to move you to the land of Goshen," but he wants them all to go there. So they're already there. It's, just easier for them just to stay, right? But they're coming up from the land of Canaan, made a long journey. They're in the land of Goshen. And he really, for whatever reason, and, of course, Joseph is being as wise as a serpent, as harmless as a dove. He's kind of setting things up the way that he wants them to go, and there's nothing wrong with that. Verse 2, it says, and he took 5 men from among his brothers and presented them to Pharaoh. Now, I'm guessing he looks at his brothers, kind of scopes them out. Okay, that guy needs a bath. That guy got attacked by an animal. He doesn't look so hot. And he only can find 5 of his brothers that are really presentable. So he picks these 5 guys to kind of represent the whole family. And he picks them, takes them before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to his brothers, what is your occupation? And they said to Pharaoh, your servants are shepherds, both we and our fathers. Now, remember, Joseph told them to say that. So they're preparing Pharaoh to say, and of course, shepherds are an abomination to the Egyptians. And so it's got it all set up already. Then Pharaoh said, and then they said to Pharaoh, we have come to dwell in the land because your servants have no pasture for their flocks, for the famine is severe in the land of Canaan. Now, therefore, please let your servants dwell in the land of Goshen. And so they've already been told what to say. This is what they're saying. Now, this has got to be a very imposing thing for them. They walk into this throne room, and I don't know if you've seen the Prince of Egypt, or probably even more so the Ten Commandments, where you have this giant throne room, and that's what it was. They did their research, and these Egyptian throne rooms where the Pharaoh would sit had many guards. They had Pharaoh way up on this pedestal, and you came in. It's very imposing. You're surrounded by guards. You're brought in. It's a good thing to know what you're going to say before you get there, right? And that's just the way that it is. And so they're coming before Pharaoh, and Joseph has completely coached them on what to say. So they tell him, we're shepherds, and we want to live in the land of Goshen. He says, verse 5, then Pharaoh spoke to Joseph, saying, your father and your brothers have come to you. The land of Egypt is before you. Have your father and your brothers dwell in the best of the land. Let them dwell in the land of Goshen. And if you know any competent men among them, then make them chief herdsmen over my livestock. So not only does he say, hey, this is the way it's going to be, but he also says, hey, if you got anybody who's competent, I don't know, maybe he's looking at these guys and he's saying, well, I'm not seeing competence here, but if you have anybody that's competent, then put them over my livestock as well. So he sweetens the deal. He makes it even better. And you can imagine, as this chapter goes on, you're going to see that this is quite the task. It's not just a simple little thing. Not only he's going to be in charge of Pharaoh's herds, but pretty soon he's going to be in charge of the whole country's livestock. And that's what whoever these men are that would be competent among his brothers. So pretty interesting. They go before Pharaoh, and they know what they're going to say. And oftentimes, it's smart to know what you're going to say beforehand, right? But not always, right? Didn't Jesus tell us that when you stand before magistrates or when you stand before governors, not to prepare beforehand what you're going to say, but the Lord will give you in the moment what you're going to say. And so we don't have to stress out about this. It's good to go in. Now, that doesn't apply to everything. That's when you stand before kings and governors, right? But it's good to know what you're going to say before you enter into a situation. Sometimes you think it over, right? Pray about it. Pray it through. Other times, you know that the Lord's going to take care of you. Actually, every time you know the Lord's going to take care of you, if you just trust the Lord. So they go in, and it says, verse 7, then Joseph brought his father Jacob and set him before Pharaoh, and Jacob blessed Pharaoh. Now you can imagine this. So we know, and it's true in ancient culture, that the greater blesses the less, right? And that could be greater in age, that could be greater in stature, but here's Pharaoh sitting on his throne. Jacob's being brought in. You can imagine that he's probably never seen anything so grand in his entire life. I mean, he's seen wealth and opulence and this throne room, but that's not exactly true, because he did see something once that was a little bit greater than that. Remember that? When he was wrestling all night with the angel of the Lord. And when he stood that one night, or when he laid down that one night in Bethel or Luz, and woke up to see the stairway, the ladder going up from heaven. Right? And so Jacob, he has things in perspective in his life. He's a very old man. He comes in before this young Pharaoh, and it says that he blesses him. Now, that's a pretty wild thing, you can imagine. This guy coming in. I mean, the Pharaoh could have his head if he wanted, right? He just comes in, he kind of hobbles in, because remember he's limping because his heel was put out of joint. And he proclaims this blessing upon Pharaoh. Pretty wild. And Pharaoh, verse 8, said to Jacob, "How old are you?" And Jacob said to Pharaoh, "The days of the years of my pilgrimage are 130 years. Few and evil have been the days of the years of my life, and they have not attained to the days of the years of the life of my fathers in the days of their pilgrimage." So it's true. His dad and his grandfather lived longer than he did. He's only 130 years old. He's a young pup, compared to them. But he's saying, the days of my life have been few and evil. Now, why had they been evil? Well, think about his life. He leaves at the age of 40 probably or so from his father's house, running for his life, getting away from Esau, dwelling in the land of his father-in-law, and just staying away from the whole group of people that he grew up with because he feared Esau. And then coming back, Laban and just all that whole drama there, and then coming back, and he's afraid to face Esau again, and he kind of just wanders around. And he's had a rough life. This guy's had a rough life. And then after he finally started to decide to follow God, his father dies, his wife dies, just really, really tough things. And so he says that the years of his pilgrimage have been evil and haven't attained to the years of his father. So Jacob blessed Pharaoh, and when he went out from before Pharaoh, and Joseph situated his father and his brothers and gave them a possession in the land of Egypt, in the best of the land, in the land of Ramses, as Pharaoh had commanded. Now, of course, it calls it Goshen, here, but then it also refers to it the land of Ramses. And that's probably because during Moses' time, that's what it was called. And so when Moses wrote this, just to give everybody perspective as to know what we're talking about, Moses would call it Ramses, but it's not clear as if they called it the land of Ramses back in Joseph's day. Probably not till much later in a later dynasty would it be called that. And so he settles them in, gets them set up there in Goshen, and totally provides. They're going to weather this entire famine, all 70 of them that came up from the land of Canaan, without any trouble at all. They're going to be provided for completely. And I found that that's the way that the Lord is. It's interesting when God basically told Israel, "I'm going to bring judgment upon you. I'm going to bring Nebuchadnezzar up, and I'm going to carry you away captive." And he told the children of Israel, "Do not resist Nebuchadnezzar the king." Now that was kind of a tough thing for them. It would almost be like saying, "Hey, I'm going to make Hillary Clinton president, or I'm going to make Donald Trump president. Go with it." It's like, what? Are you kidding me? It's just one of those things that just kind of defies logic. Nebuchadnezzar, this evil pagan king, is going to come up. He's going to take you captive. Don't resist. Go with him. And those who resisted, guess what happened to them? They were killed. And those who gave in and went with Nebuchadnezzar, they prospered in the land of Babylon. And that's why God says, "Hey, I have my plans for you of peace and not of evil, to give you a future and a hope." And he tells them, "I'm going to prosper you in the land of Babylon. You're going to have houses, and you're going to marry, and you're going to have children, and you're going to be blessed there if you will simply follow me." And that's difficult for us sometimes, because we look at the world around us and we think, man, this is just evil. I need to separate myself from it. I need to be completely against everything that's happening in the country and in the world. And yet, honestly, what God wants from us is to simply trust Him, to follow Him, to share the good news that He's given us, to share the message that He's given us, and not to get caught up in all the things of the world. Who He is enlisted to be a soldier does not entangle himself with the affairs of this life, that he might please Him who enlisted him, right? That's what Paul told Timothy. He says, don't get caught up in all the things, because there's so many things out there that can take our attention away from what the Lord wants for us. And that can be, problems in our country and everything else, but ultimately, if we trust the Lord, He's going to take care of us. And that's really where we want to stay, is in that place of trust. And that's what we see here. God is completely taking care of these guys and put them there. It says, verse 12, then Joseph provided his father and his brother and all his father's household with bread according to the number of families. Now there was no bread in the land of the famine, for the famine was very severe. So that the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan languished because of famine. So notice the contrast there between verse 12 and verse 13. Joseph gave them all bread for all 7 years, according to their families, provided all that they needed, but then he said, but there was no bread in the whole land of Egypt. Now, Joseph had bread because he'd stored up bread for that first 7 years of plenty, and now he's distributing to the people, but the people are running out of bread. Nobody else has bread. The only people who have bread, as we'll see later, are the priests and the family of Joseph. It says, verse 14, and Joseph gathered up all the money that was found in the land of Egypt and all the land of Canaan for the grain which they brought, and Joseph brought the money into Pharaoh's house. And so because of this, Pharaoh's becoming very wealthy. All the money that's in the entire land of Egypt, all the money that's in the entire land of Canaan is being brought to the temple, or into the treasure house of the king. Verse 15, so when the money failed in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan, all the Egyptians came to Joseph and said, give us bread. Why should we die in your presence? For the money has failed. Then Joseph said, give me your livestock, and I will give you bread for your livestock if your money is gone. And so, okay, if you don't have any money, then just bring your animals. And so now you can see where this becomes a pretty big task for whoever is going to keep the livestock of Pharaoh. They just start bringing, it says verse 17, they bring their livestock to Joseph, and Joseph gave them bread in exchange for the horses, for the flocks, for the cattle, the herds, and for the donkeys. Thus he fed them with the bread in exchange for all their livestock that year. So time is going on. We're probably into the 5th or 6th year of this famine, the ending of the 6th year. And it's going to go for 7 years. And so now they're bringing all their livestock. Joseph owns all the money. He owns all the livestock. Notice it says, when that year had ended, probably the end of the 6th year, they came to him the next year and said to him, we will not hide it from my Lord, that our money is gone. My Lord also has our herds of livestock. There is nothing left in the sight of my Lord but our bodies and our lands. Why should we die before your eyes, both we and our land, buy us and our land for bread, and we and our land will be servants of Pharaoh, and give us seed, that we may live and not die, and the land may not be desolate. Then Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh. For every man of the Egyptians sold his field, because the famine was severe upon them. So the land became Pharaoh's. And as for the people, he moved them into the cities, from one end of the borders of Egypt to the other end. Only the land of the priests he did not buy, for the priests had rations allotted to them by Pharaoh, and they ate their rations which Pharaoh gave them. Therefore, they did not sell their lands. And so everybody comes to Joseph, and we know from history that before the 18th dynasty, Egyptians had private ownership of land. And it wasn't this monarchy where the Pharaoh owned everything, but sometime after the 18th dynasty, Pharaoh became the lord of the entire land of Egypt. He basically owned everything. And this is the event that caused that. Now, it doesn't necessarily record that in secular history, that it was because of Joseph, or why the Pharaoh became the owner of everything, became kind of the sovereign over the entire region. But this is why. And so pretty interesting, as Joseph just he whittles the poor people down. And yet, as you'll see here, this isn't in any way an oppression. The people come to him and say, hey, we're still hungry. We want more. We'll give you our cattle. We're still hungry. Notice this time, it's their idea. The first time he said, well, give me your cattle, and he buys it from them. The second time, they said, we are willing to give ourselves. We're going to die. We might as well just give you our land and become your slaves. It says, then Joseph said to the people, verse 23, indeed I have bought you and your land this day for Pharaoh. Look, here is seed for you, and you shall sow the land, And it shall come to pass in the harvest that you shall give 1/5 to Pharaoh, 4/5 shall be your own, as seed for the field and for your food, for those of your household, and as food for your little ones. So they said, you have saved our lives. Let us find favor in the sight of my Lord, and we will be Pharaoh's servant. So here we have a situation where they give everything to Joseph. First of all, they paid this tax, and that wasn't a big deal for them. In the years of plenty, there was so much plenty that they could have lived on 1/5 of it. But they had 4/5 of it, right? And they squandered it during those years of plenty. Joseph stored that 1/5, which was going to be enough to feed everybody for the next 7 years. So you can imagine how plenteous it was. Everybody thought, man, we're doing great. This is wonderful. Life is good. And then the famine hit. And it wasn't long before everybody was coming to Joseph and realizing as the famine lingered on that this wasn't something that was going to subside anytime soon. And Joseph was very wise in the way he distributed this and very wise in the way he collected and basically possessed the entire land of Egypt, not just the money, not just the cattle, but the people all came under the authority of Joseph and all of their land. Now, this is an interesting concept because it seems like a horrible, evil dictatorship, doesn't it? And dictatorships can be very evil, and yet a monarchy is probably the best type of government that you could possibly have when the monarch is good, right? And we're going to come under a monarchy someday, actually a theocracy, if you will, but Jesus is going to rule and reign on this earth, and it's going to be very similar to this. He's going to rule and reign. Everything is going to be under his authority, and we are going to come to him for all that we need. And yet, as Christians, we live in a place in our lives where it seems that we have things, right? It seems like we have a house, or it seems like we have a car, or it seems like we have our independence and our freedom. And yet, the reality of that is when we have those things and we possess those things, we end up feeling dead, empty, lost, disappointed, sorrowful, depressed. Because all the things in the world, nothing in this world can satisfy that hunger that we have inside. And so I love the illustration here as they just come and they surrender a little bit, the money. And then they surrender a little bit more, the animals. And they surrender a little bit more, the land. And then ultimately themselves, right? Have me. And that's exactly what the Bible tells us for us, that a Savior has come into the world to save the world. And notice that's what they say of Joseph. You have saved us. You've saved our lives. Let us find favor in your sight, my Lord, and we will be Pharaoh's servants. It's the same thing. Jesus has saved us, and so we give him everything, right? Isn't that what it says in Romans chapter 12, verse 1? We've been studying that on Sunday. You know, I beg you, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies a living sacrifice to God, holy and acceptable, which is your reasonable service. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds, that you might prove what is the good or perfect and acceptable will of God. You know, and this is what we're seeing here, is this famine in the land. But honestly, there is a famine in the land, in our land, of spiritual nourishment. There's a famine. And we can choose whether to surrender to the sovereign and say, you have our lives, mercy. I have nothing to satisfy myself. I don't know how many of you guys have tried to satisfy yourself with alcohol, drugs, sex, relationships, houses, money, lands, jobs, the future. And yet those things all just fall through. They don't satisfy. And the only thing that satisfies is a relationship with Jesus. And what is so crazy about this? You want to hear what's really crazy? Is it so available to us that any moment of any day we can come boldly before the throne room of grace and say, Lord, I just really need you to be close to me today. I'm anxious. I need to give this anxiety to you. When I'm overwhelmed, lead me to the rock that is higher than I. And he is there, and he is available, and he is ready to deliver, and yet we don't go. You would think as Christians we would just be like, oh man, first thing this morning I'm hitting my knees. All day long I'm going to the Lord. And yet I even as a pastor, I've gone through seasons where it seems like, when was the last time I actually just really spent time alone with the Lord? I've been so busy that I've just been trying to do my thing. Oh, I got to get this done, I got to get that done. And just to stop and to say, Lord, I mean, I pray, everybody prays, right? I mean, you pray at meals, and you pray before you go to bed, and you pray, every once in a while for people, or for during the day, or during devotion time. But to just to realize I can't even do anything without him. And that's where we have to kind of find ourselves maintained, not being that anxious person, but taking our anxieties to the Lord, like it says in Philippians 4:6. Or when I'm overwhelmed, going to the rock, pulling yourself to that rock and saying, pull me out, and letting him put your feet on solid ground. I love that, because that's exactly what Joseph did for these people. But that's exactly what we need. To know that Jesus is everything. To know that he owns us. And until we come to grips with that simple fact that you own me, Lord, and I am yours, and you can do with me as you please, we're going to be fighting a losing battle, a very painful losing battle. And so they surrender, and I love that, the surrender that we see here. And of course, Joseph is a very benevolent, he didn't seem so benevolent to his brothers, but he's a very benevolent and caring master over the land. And Joseph made it a law over the land, in verse 26. And Joseph made it a law over the land of Egypt to this day that Pharaoh should have 1/5, except for the land of the priests only, which did not become Pharaoh's. So Israel dwelt in the land of Egypt, in the country of Goshen, and they had possession, and there grew and multiplied exceedingly. And Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years, so the length of Jacob's life was 147. And so, interestingly enough, I mean, Joseph could have said, you're going to be my slaves, I will give you whatever I want to give you, but he doesn't, does he? He says, I'm going to let you keep 4/5, again, which is pretty amazing. That's Pharaoh owns everything. But if you can do well at your land and produce well, you're going to be blessed, and we're going to be blessed. If you don't do well, you're not going to be so blessed. And so it is kind of a, you make your own future here type of a thing. But even though he owns everyone, he gives them the right to farm their own land, and he easily could have just taken all of it and given them 1/5, right? But he didn't. It's beautiful. So he's been there. So Jacob has lived in Egypt now for 17 years. And that's an interesting number. Very likely that's how long he had Joseph before he was sold off to Egypt. And now he's given another 17 years to have him while he lives in Egypt. To think you lost a son, that he's died and he's gone, and then to see him again, In a sense, that's the way it is, for anybody who's lost a child who's a believer, though, right? Because you lose your son, but then you're brought to a wonderful place to be reunited with them again. Beautiful that we have that hope in the Lord. Verse 29, when the time drew near that Israel must die, he called his son Joseph and said to him, now if I have found favor in your sight, please put your hand under my thigh and deal kindly and truly with me. Please do not bury me in Egypt, but let me die with my fathers. You shall carry me out of Egypt and bury me in their burial place. And he said, I will do as you have said. So he wants to be buried in the land of Machpelah. He wants to be buried where Abraham bought his plot of land and buried, he was buried, and Sarah was buried, and Isaac and Rebekah are buried. He wants to be buried in that same place. Interestingly enough, remember Rachel was buried outside of Bethlehem, just outside of Bethlehem. His favorite wife, the one he loved, but when he dies, he'll be buried in Machpelah, and Leah will be buried with him. Isn't that interesting? It seems as though, kind of an interesting thought, that Jacob did fall in love with Leah, that he actually did care for her, even though he didn't at first, and that's the way that it is, I mean, the reality is when it comes to marriage, it doesn't matter if you don't like the person you're married to, which happens. If you will invest in them, if you will be dedicated to love that person as Christ loved the church, or to respect that man as if he was Jesus, as the Bible tells us, you can love anybody. You can truly fall in love with anybody. And honestly, oftentimes obedience follows the love, right? You have to be obedient to do what the Lord has called you to be, and through that obedience, you'll find that there is love for that person. It's hard to serve somebody and not fall in love with them. Anyway, so verse 31, then he said, Joseph says, I'll bury you in, I'll take you to the land of Canaan, I'll bury you there. And then he says, swear to me, and he swore to him. So Israel bowed himself on the head of the bed. And so probably he thought he was going to die right then, but he didn't. So he says, swear to me, you're going to bury me there. And he promises he will. Now it came to pass, verse 1, after these things, that Joseph was told, indeed your father is sick, and he took him with his 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, and Jacob was told, look, your son Joseph is coming to you. And Israel strengthened himself and sat up on the bed. And Jacob said to Joseph, God Almighty appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan, and blessed me, and said to me, behold, I will make you fruitful, and multiply you, and I will make you a multitude of people, and give this land to your descendants after you as an everlasting possession. Now, it's likely that Joseph has been told this before when he was young, but it's been a long time. And now Jacob sees that he's dying. Israel sees that he's dying, and he wants to make sure that his son knows. Now, it would be very easy just to say, you know what, we're Egyptians now, right? We're going to live in Egypt. We're going to just enjoy it here. But this is something that's actually fascinating, and that is that no matter where God's people have gone in the world, and we're talking every single country, just about every single country in the world, God's people have been scattered to. And that happened, of course, during the time of the Assyrians, when the Assyrians came in and kind of displaced Israel. Babylon carried Judea down into Babylon. And so we see these different dispersions throughout the world, and there was Jews living mixed with Chinese, and looking like Chinese, but DNA testing proved that they actually were Jewish. They were in China, in Ethiopia, in Russia, in Germany, in every single nation of the world. They were Jewish, and they were still practicing Judaism after 2,000 years. Now these guys will be in Egypt for 400 years, but Jacob wants to make sure that everybody knows, and especially Joseph, because he's kind of the leader right now, that everybody knows that this is not our land. This is not our home. This isn't where we're going to put down roots. We are sojourning here. We are not sticking down. We're not saying this is it. And so too, for you and for me. We are pilgrims and sojourners in this land. And I love the way that Jacob put that earlier when he was talking to Pharaoh, the days of my pilgrimage, right? Because that's us. We're not here for keeps. We're not tied to anything. And I love it when, we have that attitude that it doesn't matter, wherever the Lord takes me, I can drop everything and I can go. If I have to go, if the Lord tells me to do something different tomorrow, that I have to be willing to just stop what I'm doing, drop it, and then move on to the next thing that the Lord's telling me to do. Shannon and I, when we first planted this church, I told her that. I said, honey, we have to be ready if the Lord ever calls us out of here just to leave, and if the Lord wants somebody else to be here as the pastor, then we have to be willing to leave, right? And she's like, yeah, that was really easy to say 15 years ago, when things were tough, every day was hard, and it was just like, this is a drag, and I hope that more than 5 people show up to church this Sunday, and it's rough at the beginning. And then as time went on, we fell in love with this church, and we love you guys, and I can't even imagine the Lord leaving. Claudia's starting to sweat. She's thinking I'm leaving her, and I'm not leaving, Claudia, unless the Lord tells me to. But if the Lord tells me to, you don't want me here, right? But that's the reality of it. The Lord can move us, and we have to be willing to do whatever the Lord tells us to do, right? And that is where we're going to find our peace, and that is where we're going to find our happiness, and that is where we're going to find our contentment in this life, is obeying the Lord. It's when we don't obey the Lord and we shrink back in fear rather than walk by faith that we end up finding ourselves in turmoil. And so he's saying, God Almighty told me that he's going to make us into a great nation. My descendants will be a great nation, which is you, Joseph. Pay attention. And we're going to dwell in the land of Canaan. This is not where we're staying. And so Joseph, being the responsible one, Jacob is passing on this information to him to make sure that he communicates to everybody else. Don't settle down, guys. Don't feel like this is it. Now, they're going to be there for a long, long time. But they have to remember that they're a separate people. And they're up in the land of Goshen, and no doubt that's why the Lord put it on Joseph's heart to put them in the land of Goshen so they weren't living amongst the Egyptians. And that was so important. Because if they would have lived amongst the Egyptians, they probably would have married the Egyptians. They probably would have had children with the Egyptians, and they would have amalgamated with that culture, and that would have been it. But because of this, and because of so many times that the Lord has told them to be a separate people throughout the nations and throughout the ages, the Jews have remained a people to the point where they were displaced from their land for 2,000 years. And God would bring them back, and even some of those who were dispersed by the Assyrians would bring them back into the land, and they would become a people again, which is incredible. I mean, what other nation has ever lost their homeland and been brought back into their homeland? Even after 100 years, they've assimilated into another group of people. It just doesn't happen except with Israel. So God said to me, verse 4, behold, I will make you fruitful and multiply. I will make you a multitude of people and give this land to your descendants after you as an everlasting possession. So our land is over there. Verse 5, and now your 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, who were born to you in the land of Egypt, before I came to you in Egypt, are mine as Reuben and Simeon. They are mine. That's a weird thing to say. Okay, I'm the grandpa, but these 2, I'm adopting them as my own sons. They're going to be my sons, just like Reuben and Simeon. Now, what's significant about Reuben and Simeon? They're the 2 oldest sons. I remember Reuben lost his birthright because he went up to his father's couch. He slept with his father's concubine, Bilhah. And so he's basically saying, I'm gonna adopt these 2 sons. Now, what's significant about that? Joseph, being the second to the youngest, I think in Jacob's mind he's thinking, if things would have worked out the way they should have, and I would have woke up that morning with my new wife Rachel, Joseph would have been the oldest. She would have been my wife and my only wife, and Joseph would have been my oldest, and the seed would have carried through him and on, and he would have received the birthright. And so in some ways he probably feels robbed of that, but then in another way he has these older sons that have just kind of gone off the rails. And so what he's saying is, I'm adopting not 1 son, but 2 sons. And what does that do? It gives them an equal portion, which in turn gives Jacob a double portion. See how that works? And so he's saying, I'm going to adopt your 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. They're going to be mine. And then he says, verse 6, your offspring, whom you beget after them, shall be yours. So you don't get to keep these boys, they're mine. You get to keep all the rest. Kind of funny. they will be called by by the name of their brothers in their inheritance. And so when the land is split into 12 tribes, Ephraim, Manasseh, all of your sons will fall under those tribes, under those Ephraim and Manasseh. But as for me, when I came from Paddan, Rachel died beside me in the land of Canaan on the way, when there was but a little distance to go to Ephrath, whatever. And I buried her there on the way to Ephrath, that is Bethlehem. And so he reminds him of his wife that he loved, and probably just a memory that she was my wife. She was the one I wanted. She was the one that should have been my only wife. And yet she was taken from me. Difficult memories he's sharing, and no doubt Joseph remembers this. He probably was about 14 or 15 years old when his mom died. And so a pretty vivid memory for him. Then Israel saw Joseph's sons and said, "Who are these?" So he's kind of blind. He's telling him, Ephraim, Manasseh, they belong to me, and they're standing there in the background. And they're like, huh? And he's like, hey, who are those guys? Joseph would have been about 57 years old here, and his son's in their early 20s. And so, he's an old man, or older man, not a young man anymore. And Joseph said to his father, "These are my sons, whom God has given me in this place." And he said, "Please bring them to me, and I will bless them." Now, this is interesting because you think of Jacob's life. He gets his brother's birthright. He goes in, and he believes he wants that birthright. He takes it from his brother. He goes to Bethel or Luz, and God appears to him, and he speaks to him from the ladder, and makes a vow to him, and Jacob promises God he's going to give him 1/10 of everything if you'll provide all my needs, and God agrees with that, and he's going to be Jacob's God. And then, of course, he wrestles with the angel, and he, all these things he does, goes up to Egypt, believing that his son is alive. And yet, when it's recorded in the end of his life, the one thing that's recorded as his act of faith or his act of greatness within his entire 147 years is this one moment. In Hebrews chapter 11, verse 21, and this is all that Jacob gets in the Hall of Faith. By faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph, and worshipped, leaning on top of his staff. Isn't that interesting? This was an act of faith on Jacob's part. He's in the land of Egypt. He knows he's dying. He knows that God is going to bless these boys and bless the nation of Israel, and that he's going to bring them back to the land of Canaan. And it is almost as though his heart is in that place of faith as he blesses these two boys. So he blesses them. Now, interestingly enough, verse 10, "Now the eyes of Israel were dim with age, so that he could not see. Then Joseph brought them near him and kissed them and embraced them." So he kisses these two boys. Interesting how things have switched here. Jacob was young, and Isaac was blind when he got his blessing, remember? But he didn't do it quite this nicely. Verse 11, "And Israel said to Joseph, I had not thought to see your face, but in fact God has shown me your offspring." And so, he looks at these, he can see them, close up. He's great, he's grateful. He kisses these two boys, he hugs them. And notice what he says. He says, "I didn't even think I'd ever see you again. I thought you were dead. I thought you were gone. I thought a wild beast had devoured you. And now I get to see not just you again, but your kids, my grandkids." Never thought. What a blessing this had to be. God's grace in this whole situation. So Joseph brought them from beside his knees, and he bowed down with his face to the earth. And Joseph took them both, Ephraim with his right toward Israel's left hand, and Manasseh with his left hand toward Israel's right hand, and brought them near to him. And so he's arranging it. Okay, this guy's on my left because he's going to be on Dad's right. Dad's going to bless him with his right hand because the greater would be blessed with the right hand and the lesser son would be blessed with the left hand, right? It's interesting. Then Israel stretched out his right hand and laid it on Ephraim's head, who was the younger, and his left hand on Manasseh's head, guiding his hands, knowing, for Manasseh was the firstborn. So completely yielded to God, knowing that God is leading him as he does this, giving the blessing to the younger. Verse 15, and he blessed Joseph. Notice that. He's putting his hands on the two sons, but who's he blessing? Joseph, because he's giving him a double portion. And said, God, before my fathers, Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has fed me my life long to this day, the angel who has redeemed me from all evil, bless the lads, let my name be blessed upon them, and the name of my father Abraham and Isaac, and let them grow into a multitude in the midst of the earth. So Jacob, leaning upon his staff, reaches out his hands, puts his hands on these two boys' heads, and just begins to bless them and says, God who took care of me my whole life. Interesting thought. And I don't know what you see when you look back upon your life and all the things that you've been through and all the things, dumb mistakes that you've made and just what the Lord has done in your life. It was interesting at men's breakfast this last time because Leroy Stoley, he was a pastor for years and just a neat old guy, full of energy and the love of Jesus. And he just kind of went through his whole life and just shared, blow by blow, how Jesus had just brought him through everything. And he can just look back and see God's hand and, his boss giving him his job, allowing him to go to Bible school and still paying him the same amount for less hours. And, just things like that. And how he bought a house in one day when he moved out here to Emmett. And just how God just worked everything out in his life, just the way that he would be blessed by it. And so too, Jacob saying, I'm looking back over my life. I look back over everything that has happened in my life, and I see how God has provided for me. And you look back on your life, and there might be some tough times, but you see, as a believer, God is always taking care of me. He's gotten me here, I love what Jacob said earlier in his life. Now think about it. He's leaning upon his staff now. He's blessing his two grandsons. And in Genesis chapter 32, verse 10, this is what he says to the Lord. I'm not worthy of the least of your mercies and all of the truth which you have shown your servant. For I crossed over this Jordan with my staff, and now I've become two companies. And so he basically was saying, I had nothing but my staff in my hand when I crossed over the Jordan, and now I'm coming back with two huge companies. I'm wealthy, I'm rich. But now he lays in his bed, again, with just his staff. That's all he has left, his staff. And of course, a heritage. And he talks about this angel who has redeemed me from all evil. And that's an interesting thought. The angel who's redeemed me from all evil. What angel is he talking about? You'll notice there in your Bible that it's capitalized. The angel, speaking of the angel of the Lord. When did he come across the angel of the Lord? That day when he wrestled with him, right? I will not let you go until you bless me. And then the angel putting his hip out of joint and, in a sense, his head in joint, right? Giving him a new perspective on life. And I love that. So he attributes this to his redemption and how God has redeemed him from all evil. Speaking really of Jesus, I think. Verse 17, now when Joseph saw that his father laid his right hand on the head of Ephraim, it displeased him. So he took hold of his father's hand to remove it from Ephraim's head to Manasseh's head. He didn't want the wrong thing recorded in the wrong place, right? He's like, oh, no, you can't do that. And Joseph said to his father, not so, my father, for this one is the firstborn. Put your right hand here on his head. So worried it was a mistake. He's, Dad's a little kooky. His hand's a little shaky. He's not too keen. But his father refused and said, I know, my son. He also shall become a people, and he also shall be great. But truly his younger brother shall be greater than he, and his descendants shall become a multitude of nations. So he blessed them that day, saying, by you Israel will bless, saying, may God make you as Ephraim and Manasseh, And thus he set Ephraim before Manasseh. And so he said, by saying, people are going to bless one another by saying, may you become like Ephraim and Manasseh. And as we read it throughout the Bible, it's Ephraim and Manasseh, isn't it? It's always Ephraim and the half tribe of Manasseh, And so God gives preeminence. Now this is similar to what Isaac said to Esau, remember? He says, you two are going to be a great people, you're going to be great, but your brother will serve you, or you will serve your brother. And of course the whole northern territory becomes Ephraim, which would later be called the land of Israel versus the land of Judah when the kingdoms are split. But Ephraim kind of absorbs all the other tribes. Verse 21, then Israel said to Joseph, behold, I am dying, but God will be with you and bring you back to the land of your fathers. Moreover, I have given to you one portion above your brothers, which I took from your hand, from the Amorite, with the sword and with my bow. So this is an interesting thing. He's basically saying, God, he's prophesying, God's going to bring you back into the land. You and your brothers, everybody's going to be back in the land. And we see that happen in the Exodus through Moses, as God leads them through the wilderness of sin into the land of Canaan. Now it takes 40 years of wandering for them to get there. But, God, he holds true to his promise, and he brings them into the promised land. But he says, for Joseph, I'm going to give you a special portion. Now, it's interesting because Joseph's claim to fame in the Hall of Faith, you'd think that it would say in the Hall of Faith, Joseph, by faith, trusted the Lord while he was in prison, and trusted the Lord while he was a slave, and interpreted Pharaoh's dreams. And you'd think it'd say all that stuff. But instead, what does it say in Hebrews chapter 11? By faith, Joseph gave instructions concerning his bones. That's what it says. Why? Because he said, when you guys go back to the land of Egypt, remember to take my bones with you. He's going to be dead, as he's dying. That's the only thing it gives him. By faith, Joseph gave instructions concerning his bones, that they'd be buried in the land of Egypt, and they'd be buried in Shechem. Now, this is an interesting thing, because right here he says, I have given you one portion above your brothers. The word portion actually is the word Shechem. And so it seems that Joseph's descendants would be given not only the land of Shechem, that he took from the Amorites by the sword. Now, how did that happen? Remember, Levi and Simeon, they went and killed the men of Shechem and took the land. And he says, I'm giving that to you. I'm giving that to you. Now, what's interesting is it's like, things just continue to repeat themselves as we look at this, because you remember it was in Shechem that Joseph went to look for his brothers and couldn't find them. And then he ended up over in Dothan, where they captured him, threw him in a pit, and sold him off to the Midianites. And so he starts out in Shechem on his way to Egypt, and he ends up back there after he gets back from Egypt. Pretty interesting. But, God has his whole plan for the children of Israel, and he's not going to leave them in Egypt, but he's going to prosper them there. Now, Egypt is a type of the world, of course, in the Bible. And Egypt is a type of sin, even at times. And yet, it's interesting that the nation of Israel is blessed there as long as the Lord wants them there, right? And so too for you and for me. We're going to be blessed where the Lord has placed us. And maybe you don't really like that job you're in, or maybe you don't really like that relationship, or you don't like that thing that's going on in your life right now, or you're having difficulty in this or that. But if you allow the Lord to prosper you where you're at, and what do I mean by that? I mean, allow the Lord to reveal himself to you, that you would find pleasure in the Lord, and that as you find yourself content in the place that God has you, that's usually when the Lord opens up the door to the next thing in your life. And maybe we're in the middle of pain, or in the middle of loneliness, or in the middle of suffering, or in the middle of difficulty or hardship. Or maybe just in the place of just kind of like, yeah, it's okay, but, I really feel like there's a greater purpose in my life than just doing this job for the rest of my life. And to say, God, what is my purpose? And find ourselves content where we're at, but believing God for greater things. Say, God, I believe that you're going to work these things out for good. But I found in my life, and I'm sure many of you have too, that when we find ourselves to be content, when we find ourselves enjoying God where we are, then that's when God begins to give us something greater. You know, that's what the children of Israel experienced in the wilderness as they waited on God to enter into the promised land. They had to learn that man does not live by the things he eats or by the things he wears, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. And once they can enjoy that, then they're ready. Then they're ready to enjoy wells they did not dig and houses they did not build and cisterns they did not dig and orchards they did not plant. You know, once we can find ourselves content where God has us, then he moves us on to the next thing he has for us. Let's pray.